welcoming all of you here. இன்றைய அருமையான ஒரு மாலை வேளையில் நாம் இங்கு மிக முக்கியமான ஒரு நபருக்காக, ஒரு தனித்துவம் வாய்ந்த ஒரு நபருக்காக இங்கே குழுமியுள்ளோம். So, initially and very proudly and very happily, I would like to welcome Dr. Palanivel Thiaga Rajan, the Minister of Information Technology and Digital Science of our own Tamil Nadu. We welcome you, sir. அத்தகைய மதிப்பிற்கும் மரியாதைக்கும் உரிய Mr. Lakshman அவர்களை மேடைக்கு அழைக்கிறேன். He would be welcoming and honoring our own P.T.R.
Good evening. It's my great pleasure and privilege that I have got the opportunity to welcome all of you in this great evening. And also, I believe it is my another privilege and honor that I have my friend Dr. P.T.R. is here with us, and he is one of the extraordinary economists and who always keep the welfare of the people in his mind, as his family for generation is working for the welfare of the community. And I feel I am very greatly privileged to welcome him in UAE, the soil where we all have made our fortune. So I really very, very thankful and happy to be here with him to start a session with him. And we are all, like all of you, I am waiting here to hear his speech. Thank you very much.
Politician மதிப்பிற்குரிய P.T.R. அவர்கள். ஸோ அயலகணியின் சார்பாக எஸ் மீரான் அவர்களையும் அவர்களோடு சேர்ந்த குழுவையும் நம்முடைய P.T.R. அவர்களுக்கு மரியாதை செலுத்தும் வண்ணமாக மேடைக்கு அழைக்கிறேன்.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, for the invitation by my good friend Mr. Lakshmanan, for the honor from the NRT board member Thirumiran. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. And I hope to speak for, about 30 minutes. I've just written up a few points. I'm more than happy to take questions after the session. I think we have a bit of time in the hall, so I'll try to finish with enough time for all of you to ask some questions. So the topic that was given for me was economic reforms and inclusive growth. That's a very interesting topic because it presumes that there is some need for reform, because otherwise nobody reforms things unless they need to be changed. So I thought I'll start the other way around and start with the question, why do we care about inclusive growth? Are we actually seeing inclusive growth around the world, in India, in Tamil Nadu, where I'm most familiar with? And therefore, do we need reforms? And if we need reforms, what kind of reforms do we need? And what has been my experience or our experience in government in the last few years in terms of attempting reforms and succeeding in them? So if I start at the very basics, my view of the world, as you may know, I was 30 years roughly expatriate. I lived 20 years in the US. I lived a few years in other countries. I used to be in academia. I was a banker for many years. So at a very profound level, I've always thought that really the first organization of a society should be based on what is the economic model. Is it some version of a free market, otherwise called capitalism, or is it a unitarian state model like a communist state? And I think if we assume that we have some state that is not unitarian, where the state owns all the assets, all the resources, and manages all the production, then the natural tendency of free markets, if left unconstrained, or the natural tendency of capitalism, is to have ever increasing disparities in outcomes. The rich keep getting richer, and many people get left behind. That's unmitigated, uncontrolled, unregulated capitalism will lead to that. That's, I think, not in question. In fact, there's been a lot of research in recent years, most famously in the last decade, I would say, by people like the French economist Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book that was intended to be a relook at the original economic treatise by Karl Marx called Das Kapital, Capital, which he titled Capital in the 21st century. So what he went on to show is that over time, if you look at the components of production being labor and capital, of enterprise being labor and capital, over time, as Marx predicted, the returns to labor kept reducing and the returns to capital kept increasing. And so those sitting on the capital see better and better returns for their money, being passive just because they own the capital. And those actually working in the production see less and less returns on their effort, which is human labor. And so he basically came to the conclusion that a lot of regulatory regimes, a lot of intended mitigating components of democracy, of the socialist model of state, of a welfare state, must be failing because you're starting to see what Marx predicted would happen, which is that the rich, the capitalists keep getting better off and the poor keep getting worse. Now, in the most dire view of this trajectory of Marx, it ends with effectively the need for the death of capitalism and revolution on the streets. But of course, that also has not come to pass. If anything, we have seen models of pure communism actually fail. And we have seen that even communist countries, self-professed communist countries like China, have adopted some form of market mechanisms, and the stock markets of Beijing or Hong Kong, which is a proxy for the Beijing stock market, have actually seen tremendous growth. So at some level, there is no doubt that a version of free markets or capitalism is the future. And if that is the case, then the conjoined form of government that is best suited to have a free market without extreme outcomes is the notion of democracy. And what democracy is supposed to do for us, by giving power equally, one person, one vote, and by forcing the system constitutionally to have regular elections, which means that you have to go back to the people to get a mandate to implement policies. That is supposed to be the mitigating factor, that people will vote in their interests, and if few are getting very rich, then the people will vote against those who are supporting such policies, and therefore you will end up with a less disparate, more equitable, more just society. And in that definition, automatically it means inclusive growth in the sense that development will include large sections of society rather than just a few. Now, we could have a different interpretation of inclusive growth, which means go and seek out the marginalized, the downtrodden, those who have historically been disadvantaged, but that's an even more, shall I say, one-side interpretation. Just the basic interpretation already requires that unless the great mass of society is included in your growth, then the model of free markets and the notion of democracy are not doing so well. If that is the case, I think it's fair to say that over the last few decades at least, since the 1980s, 1990s, we have seen that the expected outcomes of democracy or equitable growth or inclusive growth have been less than ideal. Partly because of globalization, partly because of financialization, which means more and more assets can be traded either in cash securities like equities and bonds, or the ownership of them can be then derivatized through swaps or other kinds of derivative instruments like call and put options or swaps, or swaptions. And so they become tradable. So the asset may be sitting as a house in California. The ownership might be already parceled into some collateralized mortgage-backed security, and the ownership may be sitting in the Bank of China, which happened in real terms. This is not a vague example. It's actual outcome that happened before the global financial crisis. So because we've seen hyper-globalization and hyper-financialization of all physical assets being easily transformed or converted into financial assets, we have basically reached a point where there is high concentration of wealth, or much more high concentration than we would like. And either as a corollary or, it's hard for me to say cause and effect. I don't know which is the cause and which is the effect. But it's true that both things have happened. The quality of democracy, the nature of democracy has become strained. A lot more authoritarian forces, a lot more extremists have been able to park themselves into the system. A lot less of the middle ground is in vogue. A lot less middle class is there. A lot less middle segment banks or middle segment companies are there. And we are starting to see more and more separation of a few big, mega, ultra global, usually corporations, and a lot of people left at the bottom. And in parallel, the quality of democracy has also started to kind of deteriorate and become much less participative and much less harmonious. And we're seeing very extreme positions evolve in democracy. So in that sense, I would say that we have a need now for economic reform. So this, I would say, is the motivation for why we should have economic reforms, because we haven't seen as great outputs or outcomes as we'd like. And then there's a question, what is it that leads to good outcomes, or are there examples of relatively good outcomes that we can study and learn from and see if we can use those as the guideposts or templates for the kind of reform we should do. And my old school, where I studied at MIT, two professors from there and another from a different university were just about a month ago awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. And their theory, which got them the prize, was that strong institutions, that is independent institutions that cannot be easily swayed by political or commercial interests, and therefore the notion of the rule of law, a level playing field, protection of rights, and robust democracy are basically the predictors of good growth and relatively good societies. Now, some have applauded the work and their recognition by the Nobel Committee. Some have argued that they've taken a very simplistic approach to the notion of good institutions and focused overly on the notion of property rights and the maintenance of pure property rights. At some level, property rights are probably the building block of good economies and good institutions and good societies, and this is going back to the days of Adam Smith, or the father of the field of economics. So, the criticism is debatable. But the point, I think, is if you look around the world, societies that have relatively good democracies, participative, where authorities, elected, and bureaucrats are held accountable, where there's relatively equitable economic outcomes, and where there is also a good democracy in the sense of rule of law and level playing field, these are easily identifiable. Many of the Scandinavian countries, some of the better countries of Western Europe, Australia, Canada, to some extent places like Singapore. So somewhere in this mix, there is enough evidence that good institutions represent the visible signs of a stable democracy, of the rule of law, of equitable conditions, of level playing field, of compassionate governments, and also show good outcomes. And in some sense, I would say the core good outcome for any policymaker, for any elected official, for any bureaucrat, the core good outcome is the quality of life of the average citizen. Do they live in clean surroundings, with safety, in a decent house, with adequate nutrition, with decent transport, with the capacity to find work and commute to that work in a reasonable way? So if you look at it from that perspective, I would say certainly there is a need for economic reforms. And if we're going to talk about reforms, I think it helps a lot to have an idea or some understanding. What really should the role of government be in the context of economies and growth? And I've said this many times before, so it's probably a bit old for those of you who've seen my videos, but I'll repeat it anyway. I'll say that in my perspective, there are probably 4 core duties of a government when it comes to the economic side. And the first is that the government should fund itself adequately, raising money in a fair way from those who can afford to pay, and use that to provide universal access to high quality public goods and services, whether it's education, whether it's drinking water, whether it's underground drainage, whether it's safe streets, proper traffic management, whatever it is. So core function of government, raise enough money in a fair and justifiable way and build a good public infrastructure, a good public education system, a health system, a transport system. The second is, I would say, to provide a good climate for private enterprise. That is, for people who want to start businesses, who want to take the risk, who have an idea, who have a vision, who want to create jobs, like Mr. Lakshmanan, make sure that the environment is conducive for them, that they are capable of pursuing their vision without either too many bureaucratic bottlenecks or hurdles, or too many interferences from unwanted kind of intrusions. Cut the red tape, keep stable policy, reduce the amount of compliance to the bare minimum, ensure a level playing field, keep the rule of law. The third, and this is in some ways the easiest and some other ways fiscally the most expensive, is to provide some kind of safety net for those at the bottom of the pyramid. And some of these may be historic, people who have been oppressed, who have not had access to education or participation. Some of these may be temporary, somebody who's lost their job and needs unemployment benefits for a period of time. But the government, by definition, should be the provider of last resort for those who either in a secular way over time or in a temporary way instantaneously are in need of additional support compared to the average citizen. And to do all of this, I would say, as a former finance minister, that the government should actually maintain its own finances, its balance sheet, its borrowings, its revenue, its expenditure in a prudent way, so that it is A, providing a stable platform and can afford to do financing of other things, and B, not borrowing so much that effectively it is reducing the pool of capital available to private enterprise. Because for those of you who would have studied macroeconomics, there's only one real source of net savings or net investable capital, and that is the collective net worth of all citizens over time. And there are only two real users of that capital. The first is governments, who finance their deficits through it. And the second is private enterprise, companies that borrow or raise equity in the capital markets, raise share capital in the markets and use it to do their business. And so to that extent, the more the government becomes a large borrower, the less it is going to leave room for private enterprise to use this capital that has been built up through personal savings of many people. Now, if you look at these 4, I would hazard to say that at this point, we are not doing so well in at least 3 of the 4. And the fourth one, we have reasonably structural problem. In the sense, if you look at the government's functioning itself, I would say most governments today are highly inefficient, inadequately computerized or technology platform based, have limited institutional memory, have limited institutional capacity build up, and therefore their execution of the model of administration and governance is very weak. And I say this apart from politics, I say it across the world. I say that the nature of governments is that they are a monopoly. Companies compete with each other in a relatively even market, mostly, whereas every government by design is a monopoly in that place. So the politicians who get elected to government are usually very competitive in politics. But the notion of administration, there can be only one government of X. There cannot be competing governments. And so very often we find that governments have actually underinvested, are under capacity and not capable of doing as efficient a job. And therefore they fail a lot around the world. I'll come back to some evidence in a minute. They fail a lot around the world in the core responsibility of raising adequate revenue and providing high quality public goods and services, or continuously improving access to public goods and services. The second is that because they don't raise adequate revenues, very often they don't have fiscal prudence and they're not managing the fisc properly. Especially prior to COVID, after the global financial crisis, and after COVID, because of COVID, many governments' debt to GDP ratios or the extent of their borrowing has become much higher than it used to be, let's say 10 years ago or 15 years ago before the financial crisis. So not doing such a good job on public goods and services, not doing such a good job on fiscal prudence and policy. What about level playing fields and ensuring the rule of law and a good enterprise climate for private enterprise? There also, I would say, in many places we have started to see some version of crony capitalism creep in. Either because the corporations have become so good that they can buy influence, and this, my good friend, very famous economist Raghuram Rajan, wrote a book long ago called Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And that main notion was that in a free-for-all economy, if you get mega corporations like Amazon or Google or Apple or relative monopolies or oligopolies in some products, they become so rich and so powerful and have so much money that through lobbying or through the influence of public debate and policy, they can basically change the outcome of elections in a way that suits their benefit. I'm not equating it directly here, but somebody, good friend of mine, made a point the other day that a certain businessman in space and technology and electric vehicles in the US invested a few $100 million of his money in the campaign of the US election, federal election, and post the election results, his company's stock prices went up by hundreds of billions of dollars. So there you have a potential classic example where you invest in the hundreds of millions and you reap benefits in the hundreds of billions. So crony capitalism in some form or the other has basically become prevalent all over the world. So what do we have as a result? As a result, in fact, The Economist magazine recently did a whole article, a whole issue on this. As a result, most governments around the world, I'm talking across emerging markets, developed economies, the West, the East, most governments around the world are increasingly focused on the distribution of cash or direct benefits to the population, to an ever-increasing percentage of the population financed by ever-increasing debt. That's basically where we're at now. That's, and if during the Q&A, if somebody wants to give me some examples of some place where that's not happening, I'll be happy to react. Of course, I will exclude those entities or those governments where a lot of their wealth is coming out of commodities or natural resources like oil or gold or mines or places like that, because that's a different economic model altogether. I'm talking about those countries that have not that kind of benevolence from nature, that they are endowed with hundreds of billions of dollars of natural resources, but they have to actually compete in a global economy with their human capital and with their, the efficiency with which they can run their government and make a success of their democracy. And in that sense, I would say, if all that's left is to raise some revenue inefficiently, borrow the rest, and then give ever-increasing handouts to ever-increasing segments of society, then of course the nature of government and of its 4 responsibilities, and 3 of them, it is failing quite badly. Now, let's just set that aside for a second and take one other perspective before I start looking at what kinds of reforms and what kinds of inclusion. There are some major macroeconomic shifts that have happened in the last 10, 15 years after the financial crisis. So if we take the year 1990, I think is a good turning point. It's a good turning point for 2, 3 reasons. At that point, the US was coming out of a major recession and a stagflation problem, and kind of hitting its new stride. In India, we had just around the early 90s had the big liberalization reforms, and we were starting to see the integration of India into the global economy and the acceleration of growth that followed. It was also the point at which China's per capita income was roughly the same as India's. Actually, on a PPP basis, it was slightly less than India's in around 1989, 1990. And probably it was the beginning of what I would call the major kind of China trade of the world, where effectively the rest of the world outsourced all its manufacturing into China. And in return, China started doing huge capital investments in its country and using the excess returns to buy up the sovereign debt of the US government, of the European governments, and basically built up its foreign exchange reserves from a few hundred billion dollars to 4.8 or 5 trillion dollars worth of reserves, all in a 18 or 20 year period. That trade started to unwind a little bit after the global financial crisis, and started to unwind in a big way after COVID, especially after the disruptions of the supply chain and all these just-in-time inventory models that broke down when you basically had to stop all shipment, all processes, all factories, all purchases, everything. So now we are in a new era, and there is a significant wind blowing away from China in multiple ways, including, as I would say, in the recent election results in the US. But in any event, that trade was done, and we were waiting to see what the next kind of global macro trade would be. And I would say it's already upon us. I was in Singapore 2-3 days back speaking at an event about human capital development and capacity building. And somebody asked me, there's already a huge shortage of skilled labor all over the world. AI is coming, it's going to create new problems. And so it's a very complicated question. And I made some statement about the fact that for now, I think AI is more augmentative than replacement level. And maybe it takes 5 to 10 years before AI's usage is that cheap, that easily available with computing power, that much energy for that many data centers, and it completely starts replacing jobs en masse. And they mistook that to say that no, the capital problem, human capital problem is not already upon us. I go the reverse. I say, including this room and including many travels to the many countries I've made this year, there is already a different era in human capital globally. And to a large extent, it is the era of India, in the sense that at this point today, roughly 1 in 6 people alive on the planet is Indian origin. You take away the components of society that are aging, and that becomes more like 1 in 5, because even the Russias, Japans, Chinas of the world are aging. You take away the components of the world that don't have access to basic education or nutrition, that are in strife like large parts, or not large parts, but significant parts of the African continent. And now you're looking at somewhere like 20 to 25% of the workforce of the world for the next generation is going to have to be of Indian origin. Now that can be multiple ways, right? It can be talent, like many of you here, that comes. It can be work that is shipped to India. It can be work that is done over the wires. It can be factories. It can be temporary migration. It can be permanent migration. But especially in the areas of healthcare, of engineering, of design, of manufacturing, in many places, there's going to be this trend accelerating. So at a macro level, if you're sitting in a place like Tamil Nadu or India, then really what you're looking at is, yes, you want to do economic reforms. Yes, you want to make the government more reactive, responsive, proactive in some ways, reactive to the problem and proactive before it becomes a big problem. And to do the kinds of reforms that will give you not just inclusive growth, but high inclusive growth. You need to raise the rate of growth. The current rate of 6-7% is neither our potential nor, in my opinion, adequate for us to realize relatively good societal outcomes. If we grow only at this rate, we're going to end up leaving a lot of young people unemployed or underemployed, and there will be a lot of social costs to pay for that. So in that context, I would say, in my view, I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 major economic policy reforms that I think we need right now, and then talk a little bit in the end about what we are doing in Tamil Nadu along those lines, and then I'll stop and we can have a more interactive discussion. So I would say the first thing is, it is incumbent on governments to increase the efficiency and the capacity of administration and governance. We don't have proper functioning of government. The notion of what is designed in the Constitution, the levels of audit, of accountability, of validation, of verification, the institutionalizing of capabilities of memory is basically way behind. So a good corporate, the kinds of things they did with IT to improve productivity, to improve institutional memory, to improve organizational capability, what they did 30 years ago, 35 years ago, 40 years ago, most governments are only doing partially now. So all of us in government, I think, our first job is to improve the platform that we run and improve the efficiency and its output and its capabilities, its memory, its sustained organizational capability. And in my view, and I've said this in many places, right now, if, at least in India, in Tamil Nadu, I would say around the world, if the government spends 1 unit in anticipation of achieving some objective, my best guess is that somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6 actually goes to that purpose. That's how inefficient the system is. That's also an indication of how much room for improvement there is. The second is, if we do that right, we can actually improve the fiscal position of the government and not need as much borrowing, not need as much interest payments, not need as much crowding out of the public access to such capital out of the limited pool of savings that exists. If we do that, we can start to not depend on our favorite people to do politics, and we can start to focus on ensuring more of a level playing field, stronger institutions, more rule of law, and not need the kind of insider dealing, authoritarian models that have taken over much of the world. And those models inevitably lead to crony capitalism and therefore inevitably lead to lower growth rates, lower entrepreneurship, lower employment. I'll say this very clearly in a different way that most people can understand. It is not possible in a country the scale of India that 2 or 3 favored industrialists of any government can achieve the economic outcomes and the scale and efficiency of operations that is equivalent to several tens of thousands or several hundreds of thousands of MSCs and individual entrepreneurs if they were given freedom to operate and a level playing field. This notion that a champion, even if it's a favored champion of the state, of the power that be, can somehow do things better is a completely fallacy. It's completely illogical because the scale of India is such. Not even the best industrialist with the best administrative design is capable. You know, there used to be all these legends in the US about the GE management model where they had actually got premium value for the model of administration. Complete nonsense. Right? Maybe it was possible in one era in a country like the United States. Even now, GE itself is a case study of failure. So the notion that in a place like India you can have one or two, some insider, specialists who will somehow do well is completely wrong. And if we continue down that path, we are paying a huge economic price for it in every way possible, from reduced growth to less inclusion, to less jobs, to less development, and to more social strife and more strains on democracy. I think the two other things we need to think about is we are a highly centralized country. The Constitution was written before there were even states defined. So though we have the right terminology in pretense of saying it's a federal, say India shall be a union of states, in fact the states were not even carved out when the Constitution was adopted. So most of the powers are actually in the government of India, and no other country of any size has this much concentration of power this far away from the people. We need to devolve power significantly from the union to the states and from the states to the local bodies, and only then is it likely that the government and the administration will be responsive to the people, because otherwise the scale is profoundly wrong. If somebody wants to ask me a question about that, I'll give you the math behind it. But right now we are designed for failure because there's some individual or small committee in Delhi trying to set a policy for vast areas and great disparity, right? Like in every statistic, the states vary so much that it makes no sense to have this notion of one nation, one policy. Finally, I would say something very urgent for all of us, particularly people who live in parts of India like I do or in Kerala. We were already a relatively high volatility, high risk location in terms of the climate conditions. In places like Madurai or Chennai, 80+% of our rainfall annually, historically, fell in a 45 to 60 day period. That's just the way the pattern of weather is because of the monsoons and where we are. That itself required significant management, because it's one thing to avoid floods, it's another thing to have to store the water so that you don't run out of water for the remaining 10 months. This our ancestors had figured out and done a lot of work in creating so many storage bodies with so many different names and so many different purposes and so many different channels and integration over the millennia of evolution of our cultures. All that has been trampled upon dramatically by kind of aggressive growth with very little thought for urban policy, planning, conservation, water management, etc. I say this across all parties, across all governments. So what we have now, once we have climate change upon us, now we are suffering the double consequences. One of lack of preservation of the original design, and now seeing even more exacerbated events. Last month, just to give you an example, on the 28th of October, in parts of my city, Madurai, in some areas we saw 4.5 centimeters of rainfall in a 15-minute period. 15 minutes, 45 millimeters. In some areas we saw 100 millimeters of rainfall in 60 minutes. Effectively across the district, we had about 160% of the annual average rainfall in the month of October, following 140% of the average rainfall between the onset of the southeast monsoon and September. So the ground was already saturated, the water bodies were relatively full, and then we had this deluge. So now we are finding the consequences of 40, 50 years of lack of attention to this. So I would say, if you don't want to have disasters, if you don't want to be giving out relief every time, if you want to be more resilient, if you have to deal with climate change, it's an urgent priority now. As important an economic reform as any other is to spend a lot of time making yourself environmentally suited to conditions of today and the risk of tomorrow. Altogether, I would say one last thing on this front, which is to say that the experience of the last 25 years of large money transfers through the Finance Commission's recommendations from the relatively rich states of the South and to some extent the West to the relatively poor states of the North and to some extent the East has proven that money is not a panacea. Money cannot get you outcomes if you do not do other accompanying reforms. We have kept on transferring greater and greater amounts of money, and we have gone to not only seen a lack of convergence or increasing equalization, we have seen an accelerating separation. So I give you only one data point. In 2014, under the then Finance Commission's formula, plus the central government's discretion, for every 1 rupee that the state of Tamil Nadu got, the state of Uttar Pradesh got about 2 rupees 95 paise. At that time, the state of Uttar Pradesh's GDP was 1.18 times that of Tamil Nadu's, and the per capita GDP of Uttar Pradesh, which has a much larger population than Tamil Nadu, was about 43% of Tamil Nadu's per capita GDP. Fast forward to 2024, for every 1 rupee that Tamil Nadu is allocated, both share of taxes plus central grants and schemes, Uttar Pradesh gets 4 rupees 23 paisa, from 1:2.9 to 1:4.23. And Uttar Pradesh's GDP has gone down from 118% of Tamil Nadu's down to 94% of Tamil Nadu's. And the per capita GDP has gone down from 43% of Tamil Nadu's down to 33% of Tamil Nadu's. So money cannot solve your problems if you're not doing something different profoundly. Just giving money to a problem never fixes anything. We have not just these 10 years, we have 25 years of legacy to show that. I'll conclude by saying that in Tamil Nadu, in the last 3.5 years at least, since we have been in government and I've been a minister, we have focused on reforms at multiple levels. In the short term, we are focusing on things like, for short-term benefit, we are focusing a lot on enhanced policies to draw investment. We've seen some result from that and therefore job creation. And also a lot on skilling to ensure that those finishing high school, the diploma level, the ITI level, polytechnic level, the college level, have better skills, more likely to be needed in today's environment. And there's a lot of things we've done, from creation of new schemes to ramping up of old schemes to allocation of more money. Roughly about 3 million people, young people, have had benefit from these schemes, and roughly about 1.5 million of them have found employment because of this reskilling. We are also focusing, as I say, on attracting much more capital. We've had good results for that. I can talk about that. Things that we think will have medium-term benefits. We have greatly increased our effort in the nourishment and nutrition and health of our citizens in the, particularly in the early years and in the maternal years. We now deliver chronic medicines, chronic disease medicines to the home. We do physiotherapy at home. We do breakfast schemes for all elementary school children at the government schools, free breakfast. We have focused a lot on improving educational infrastructure in schools, libraries, computer rooms. And on the environmental front, we have created a climate council and established a goal. The Prime Minister says India should be carbon neutral by 2070. We have said that Tamil Nadu needs to be carbon neutral by 2050. And already about 30% of our energy is renewable. We are aggressively on a path to get there 20 years ahead of India to be 100% carbon neutral. In the policies that have long-term benefits, we have focused a lot on improving infrastructure and facilitating ports, airports. These are all minimum 10-year horizon projects, better networks, We are about to complete the Tamil Nadu fiber network, which is 1 gig pipe to 12,650 villages. We think that increased connectivity will greatly improve access, equity, and the technology transfer, plus learning to all these places. We want to improve the health platform quite a bit. I started those reforms when I was in finance. We spend a lot of money. I think we could get a lot better benefits from it, from the money we spend. And overall, I would say, at least in the years that I was in finance, we focused greatly on improving the fisc of the state. 2 years in a row, we borrowed less than the year before. That was a historic improvement. Greatly reduced the revenue deficit, greatly improved the revenues as a percentage of the urban local bodies' revenues after 25 years. Not even 1 rupee adjustment for inflation. We actually changed the electricity and property tax rates, still a small fraction of what it is in Hyderabad or Bangalore or Pune or other big cities, but at least partially towards self-sustaining local bodies and to reducing the big losses in the electricity system. Though I'll be the first to admit that even though rates were irrational and we've come closer to market, there are huge losses and inefficiencies in the way the electricity department is functioning and can be greatly improved. And my colleagues in that ministry are working hard on that, including separating the supply lines for agriculture and other services so that we can actually see what is agriculture instead of just being written off as agriculture whenever we have line loss. And also to put smart meters in many places so we can see where there are leaks, what's happening. Also enable retail generation of renewable energy by having reversible meters so that those who have solar on their rooftop can basically get netting for the electricity that's generated. So these are just some of the reforms. But in conclusion, I would say the fact that what we are seeing today is, I think, by most people's ideas, not what was intended by the respective founders of our democracies, let's say in the US or the UK or India. The fact that we are not seeing democracy function in the way it should, the fact that we are starting to see greater and greater separation of the haves and have-nots, and greater and greater stress on the fabric of democracy suggests that, in fact, we do need a lot of reforms. And, at some level, all reforms start with economic reforms. And in particular, we should focus on ensuring inclusion of the majority of people into the opportunities and pathways for growth and the support systems the government provides, mostly universal public goods and services of high quality. Thank you very much.
What a remarkable speech it was. It was so much of detailing. I don't know whether everybody went into the nook and corner of that. It was more of economic reforms. Nare explain pannanga. There were two things which were, as entrepreneurs, we have to accept. He said one very important point which struck me was major macroeconomic shifts after COVID. These plays a very important role in every entrepreneurship, from small scale to the larger scale industry. And it was really an eye-opening thing. And he also said that these 2 years, they have done a lot of improvement. And their own challenges they are facing from the constitutional rights which had been written long back and until now. It was very remarkable. Thank you so much. So, we are going to the conversation session. So, to converse with such a great, brilliant brain, we want another person who's all with the same categorization of knowledge, or at least the information technology thing. So we have Mr. Sadiq Basha here. So நீங்கள் எல்லாரும் கண்டிப்பாக யோசிப்பீங்கள்ல, யாருடா அது கேள்வி கேட்க போகிறது உட்காந்து அப்படின்னு. அதுக்காக அவங்கள பற்றி ஒரு சின்ன introduction, okay? He is a financial and technological professional with a specialization in data analysis. Mr. Sadiq has worked with some of the largest financial institutions and wealth funds globally, and he currently now works for the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi. He holds a master's degree in computer applications, and he has an MBA in finance from the Manchester University. Now, not only that, as an entrepreneur, he has experience with tech startups and is well versed in the MSME business climate in India. So, on aspects of his literature, because we are here in a literature forum today, this has to be put up on board. So, as an adherent reader, Mr. Sadiq excels in subjects such as history, politics, world literature, management, fiction, and a great part in Tamil literature. Sadiq is a regular speaker of Barani, the monthly writers meet in UAE. Now, as an NRI for 25 years, he also has a deep understanding about the difficulties and challenges faced by the NRI here. So I would like to invite Mr. Sadiq Basha here on board.
Thank you, everyone. That's a very eye-opening speech, very insightful. Let me start from the topics which you mentioned as well. And I like to ask smaller questions, but at times I have to ask longer questions for the benefit of the crowd, so please bear with me. I hope you would do that. You said that, some of the 4 topics, the enhanced policy for investment and the investments have to come. Many of us here, when we look at NRIs, the typical NRI, people think the rich NRIs driving Porsches, but not all the case, right? Many of us here are slightly upper middle class. We also want to contribute to the economy and the democracy. Unfortunately, we couldn't contribute to the democracy, as you know. But we want to contribute to the economy. And how can we contribute to the economy? Not as the bigger forum, but a smaller forum. Maybe in the recent speech, you spoke about the incubation center in IIT, and you are starting an incubation center in Madurai. Is there any way we could include ourselves, so to speak, in those things?
Well, I think this is a very good question. So I think, a lot of places, our biggest weakness is that many of our young people are first-generation entrepreneurs and first-time college graduates, in fact, not just first-generation entrepreneurs, first-generation college attendees. And so many of them have not had the kind of mentoring or the kind of exposure to, the possibilities of the world, or what is the scale of opportunity. So one of the things we'd like to do is, and if you look at when we talk to a lot of forums, we talk about the diaspora of Tamil Nadu and of India being one of the great strengths that we hope to leverage. So in an ideal world, what the best case outcome looks like is that we find a way to take the insights, the mentorship, the guidance, the wisdom of people who have gone abroad and done well as professionals, as entrepreneurs, as middle-size enterprises or large-size enterprises, as well as their capital if they want to invest, and find a way to efficiently channel it to the right people in the startup space in terms of both funding as well as mentorship, etc. So the thing we have to do is to find an efficient way to do this channeling. Because it's very difficult for individuals. I mean, if you're a big company, you have billions of dollars, you can set up your own platform and use that. But in fact, the scale that we want is to involve everybody. So we've already announced and in some cases started, but I don't know how well it's going because the government is a big entity. We have announced venture capital funds and kind of incubation support committees that are made up of NRI capital or NRI mentors to things like this Tamil Nadu Startup Mission, TANSIM, and the TAN Seed Fund and things like that. But to be honest, I have not really applied my mind to what is the most efficient way. I know that multiple efforts, when I was in finance, we started some efforts. I know that the startup mission under the MSME department has some efforts. Of course, in my IT department, we have IT&T Hub. We have advisors for that. I do a lot of connects and I bring a lot of people to the system. We do these conferences like you imagine where we put together, at least for those 2 days, investors and mentors with startups. So we bring like 100, 150 startups and maybe 10,000 or 12,000 students live and maybe 50 or 70,000 students by streaming into this, to get the exposure, to be able to pitch and so forth. But it's something we're working on. I think if you give me, at least from my perspective, though it's not 100% my responsibility, I think we could do better. We could improve the efficiency of that interface. But certainly we see that as a great strength, and I would admit that we are not leveraging it or using it enough today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's where we all wanted to see. We want to contribute. We want to include ourselves one way or other to the economy. Thank you, sir. So there's another interesting point you mentioned during your speech, that 20% of the global workforce could be the Indians. It's a prophecy, I would say. Like, it's a very interesting prophecy for us. And most of us here, most of us are first generation graduates, and we came here and we are sending our kids to top elite institutions and stuff like that. But while this is happening for us, in a recent interaction Professor Abhijit Banerjee was talking about the exclusion happening in the education industry, right? Because of the education has become elite. So people who have, the job market has become competitive. So people who have enough money can go to elite institutions, which most of us do, which actually includes a lot of middle class without money from going into these elite institutions, and kind of excludes them from cream job market. So that's something I see when I go back to India as well. When I visit Tamil Nadu, a lot of bright kids are not able to get the same quality of education compared to our kids, not so bright, but because we are financially possible, right? So how that inclusion, how do we bridge that gap?
See, that's a very interesting question. I actually will break it into 3 or 4 different issues, right? If you take Tamil Nadu, I would say that our inclusion is much, much better than most places, and much, much better than it used to be. Right now, if you take, I would say more than 50% of the total population graduating high school is female. That itself is the first sign of inclusion. I would say that, even in the tribal areas, the Dalits are decently included. The tribal areas were bad. We started to do better. But for us, basically, we have 2-3 different problems. The first problem is we scaled educational opportunities exponentially. When I graduated REC Trichy in 1987, around the same time Mr. Lakshmanan graduated from Thiaga Rajan College, the state of Tamil Nadu produced about 4,000 engineers from something under 10 colleges. Today, there are hundreds of colleges producing tens of thousands, maybe 150 to 200,000 engineers a year. Clearly, you must have been accommodating a variance in quality. There's no way you can scale from 4,000 to, let's say, 40 times in 2 generations and maintain the same quality. So we have a quality problem, and that quality problem manifests itself in the fact that there is a very inefficient market for labor, at least relatively skilled labor in Tamil Nadu. That is to say, there are tens of thousands of college graduates, paper degree, not just engineering, all degrees, who are without jobs. And then there are tens of thousands of jobs without enough qualified people. So there is some gap between what is being taught in these colleges and what is the skill required in the market. So that's why we have taken all these initiatives when we came, starting with Mudal, when literally 28 lakh students have been through these finishing programs, all the way from soft skills and better English to Python and coding and different things. And in places like in my department, ICT Academy, which is the biggest of its kind government company in India, already has offices in 10 states, scaled up in a big way. We used to do, let's say, 30-40 crores of contracts a year. Now we're doing 100 crores this year. So we have focused a lot on bridging that information inefficiency. We run so many conferences a year called Bridge. Bridge the big recruiters and the specialist companies come and tell the curriculum designers of the universities and colleges, what is it that we are looking for? Therefore, how should you adapt how you train these children? So in the every year in some 15 places in Tamil Nadu, in India, we do it, and we have thousands of college placement officers and curriculum designers all the way to vice chancellors of universities attend. And on this side, we have tens or hundreds of companies that are recruiters, plus companies like Microsoft or Indian companies like MongoDB or specialist companies like Nemesek Group for BIM, they come and give their products, their services, they talk about what it takes, why there's so much demand for people in the BIM space. So we are trying to bridge this information inefficiency in the short term. That's problem one. Separate problem is, are you getting enough people into school and keeping them there long enough till they get out? That I would say, so far we have done relatively well relative to most parts of India, but we could do a lot better. And to do a lot better is why we have redesigned all these schemes in the Thaliki Thangam, effectively cash for marriage and all that, we have converted into scholarship. So we say if you studied at a government school and you're going to college, we'll give you, instead of one time 25,000 or 50,000 to get married, we'll pay you 1,000 rupees a month as long as you keep on studying. So we encourage you to go, and this is for the poor people, the girls. Now we have expanded to the boys, we've expanded to the aided schools. So we have seen tens of thousands, at least in the first year, we have seen some 60-odd thousand people who had already graduated school but did not go to college because they couldn't afford it. Now come back and take this scheme and go to college. So, we have to include better, and for us, it is mostly around making sure that our intent is actually realized in outcome. You take the breakfast scheme. This elementary school breakfast scheme has improved attendance. I'm not talking about enrollment. Has improved attendance in every single school where we put the scheme. Right? Every single school, between 10% and 100% improvement in attendance. அதாவது முன்னால் absentee rate 8% இன்னைக்கு 0. Right? People come because they get breakfast, and it's not that they were not getting food, it's that most mothers were not able to get up in time and cook before 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock to send these kids to school with breakfast at 8 o'clock. So serving them cooked food at 7:30 or 8 in the morning increases the likelihood that the pressures on the families reduce. They come. So you have to look at all these interventions in every way possible. And I say this without politics. Different parties have done different things, whether it's the ADMK, whether it's DMK. The great thing about Tamil Nadu, we have kept continuity going. Now going back to your biggest point, I didn't say that this is a projection. I'm saying it is a fact. I'm saying that 20 to 25% of the young population between the ages of 0 today and 20 years from now will be of Indian origin. Now, whether you can get them into school, whether you can get them out of school, whether you can give them the right skills, these are all the policy challenges. The facts are the facts. On the demographic trends we have today, 20 to 25% of the young possibly able to come to the workforce with the right skills population will be of Indian origin. That is the fact. Now the question is, are you going to seize on that? Are you going to get them all to the right place? Now I'll say, we have relatively minor problems because we have got some of the basics right. There are places where it's much, much worse. For example, even you take a state like Gujarat, which is a per capita income roughly the same as Tamil Nadu, slightly better, slightly worse depending on the year. 50% of the girls at 18 are not in high school, have dropped out. I mean, at 16 to 18. How will you get weighted average productivity? We'll take a worse problem. You go to poorer states like Bihar or UP. Many children are not in elementary school. In fact, in Bihar today, the average education of the Bihar population, though it's reflective of a lot of history, the average education of the Bihar population, which is average age 19, is elementary school dropout. Now, if you don't have them in elementary school, you're lost, you're dead. After that, you can't bring them to middle school, you can't bring them to high school. What skill trade will you teach today that doesn't need at least elementary school education? Mechanica, AC mechanica, car mechanica, plumbera, ellam pressure pump aayirchu. So if you want to teach any basic skills today, you have to have them up to a certain level of education. If you don't start that on day one, then you're perpetually behind. So those are different problems. By God's grace, we don't have that much of that. And yet I will tell you, after the COVID pandemic, to my knowledge, we're the only state, we set up this Economic Advisory Council with really super global economists. On their pressing, we designed a remedial education program for the 2 years lost to distance learning. So we are still running that. Illam Thedi Kalvinu design பண்ணி ஊரூரா பிளாக்கா கிராமபா அரசாங்கம் பில்டிங்கில் சாயந்தர நேரத்தில் 2 மணி நேரம் 3 மணி நேரத்துக்கு முதல்ல just to get them there and reintegrate the social concept of learning, then support with homework, then supplementary classes. It's a complicated scheme. I don't want to, we spent a lot of time designing it. But by God's grace, we had already had a study done by JPAL before the pandemic on the education levels. The results weren't great, but we had a benchmark. 2 years later, we took a study. Everybody had fallen behind by 2 years. That means distance education didn't move the needle at all. Because distance education for my children works fine. Each one sits in his own room, each one has his own computer. There's only 6 people in his class plus the teacher. In one Zoom screen, they can all see each other. It's almost as good as being in school. If you're a poor person's child, he has 3 children, they all live in a 200 square foot house, they have one phone. What does distance education mean to them? Nothing. It's the equivalent of no education.
Yeah.
So they fell behind. After this Illam Thedi Kalvi, we did the study again. So we had the baseline before. We did one right after the pandemic was over, and then we did it 1 year later after we put in this program. And we found that 85% of this loss was recovered. Not only that, we found that the poorest people were the most likely to send their children to this program because they needed it the most. Yep. They got the best benefit. So, it all depends what your priorities are and how much attention to detail and how driven and motivated you are to get the right outcomes. Right? You want to do it, you can do it. Different people need to do different things.
Thank you, sir. Very detailed answer. Thank you. During this, the answer, you brought up some interesting point. Like, of late, there is a lot of talk going on here about, or at least in the social media circle, about the gift city, the Gujarat International Financial City. And I, being a fintech professional, I'm trying to hire people for the last 6-7 months, and so many resumes, interviews. We get tired of the quality of people we get from India. Even recently, my manager said, no more Indian CVs, enough of it, that kind of quality. But even if, but 90% of the resources come from South, especially from Chennai, right? Even if in Chennai itself we have this kind of skill gap in fintech, how is going to be there in Gujarat, but it's their problem? My bigger question is, like, we are building this fintech city in Chennai. I think it's 5.6 million space with 8,000, 9,000 people. But then I looked into the university curriculums of this year. I didn't see a single university with a financial engineering or anything like that. That's when I start, like, we are having a fintech policy. When I looked at the policy, I do see that there is lines about education, but that didn't show in the curriculum. There was a massive skill gap I'm seeing there.
No, I agree, and though I won't say too much because I'm in active politics and I shouldn't comment on other people's portfolios. I'm only the minister for my department. But I'll say it slightly differently. In Tamil Nadu, we have a different problem and a different solution than what you think. We are graduating somewhere between 15, 20, 22% of the talent in engineering, in diploma, in fintech, in whatever every year. In the level on the level of the national pool, we are graduating, and we have been for years. So now our problem is that most of our people, not most, significant part of our people are actually not working in Tamil Nadu. They're working in Bangalore, in Hyderabad, in Pune, in Delhi, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in New York, in Germany, in France somewhere. I'll go the other way. If I go and look at the population of the IT industry in Bangalore, maybe 20-25% is Kannadiga. Maybe 20% is Tamil, and the rest is all other nationalities, all other origins. I go to Hyderabad, maybe 30-35% is Telugu, maybe 15-18% is Tamil, then all the rest. Like this I can go around. If I come to Chennai, and Tamil Nadu is unique in the sense, unlike other cities which have only one major center, Tamil Nadu has Chennai plus the greater Chennai area plus Coimbatore plus Madurai plus so many urban areas. But let's just take Chennai as an example. In Chennai, if I go and look at the IT population, 85% is Tamil. right?
Yep.
Now, this is good and it's bad, right? It's good. Most companies are happy. People are local. They don't have high attrition rates. They don't have high wage escalation, all this stuff. I was somewhat disheartened to find that when I went to some of these GCC forums, managing directors who are not of Tamil origin were giving me some feedback saying, but you see, the problem is all those places feel cosmopolitan. And in Chennai, we feel alien because everybody speaks Tamil to each other. And so, we feel a bit this thing. So, of course, and I know that, we are a culture that has been seafaring, that has been globally minded, going back to our ancient literature, the notion of Yadum Mure, Yavarum Kelir. So it is not that we want to be exclusionary. It is that there's no other place practically in the world that has this much concentration of local talent. So the work for me is that we are trying to facilitate, make it easier for them to come in, easier for them to learn Tamil, easier for them to lease apartments, easier for them to acclimatize, show them that we are not inherently racist or exclusionary. This is a different story. But what I'm saying is, we have been generating so much talent that many of our talent, and because of what I would say is adverse selection, that is, the best of the talent is the one that's going to get bid away to the Bay Area, or to New York, or to London, or to Bangalore. And so we have so many people away that were we to really get the right investment and the right office space and the right square footage, we would actually see them come back and drive this, right? We have seen that in the AVGC industry. We have seen that in many IT companies. In fact, I'll give you two examples. HCL in Madurai, where the lead returning person was somebody from the US. They went from 0 to 7,000 employees in Madurai in 6 years. And they're not doing like IT, BPO and all. They are running the lotteries of many of the US states. They are doing miniaturization of dialysis machines. They're doing like engineering, R&D, high-end regulated activity in Madurai. 7,000 people, right? Wow. Same way in Chennai, we have this big media company called Comcast NBC Universal. Came with one gentleman returning home a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. This year, they're going to 6,000 people. Many of those jobs used to be in China or were slated to go to China, have come here. They're doing AI work, they're doing high-end work. So we have the great luxury that we have a talent pool that is not just local but global and is eager to return, especially post-COVID. A lot of people want to come back, be closer to their families, closer to their assets, whatever it is. So in the short term, I'm not worried about this gap. Anyway, this gap cannot be closed in the short term. It's not like the university will change the curriculum today and therefore from next year's class onwards they'll be brilliantly good. It takes a time for this. Yep. So that's why we have Bridge, that's why we have ICT Academy, that's why we have Non-World, that's why we're working with the universities. So in the medium term, I hope that we will better shape the curriculum of these universities to suit the market needs, and that's an ongoing process. It's not like the market needs are set for the next 5 years. So we need a dynamic exchange. In the short term, I'm not worried. If we build it, if we get the capital and we build it, they will come because they're all over the world, ready to come. Right?
Thank you, sir. One another thing, sir. Most of us, like I asked in the first question, are middle income or slightly upper income people here, right? And we send money back home, and it does introduces some cash flow in the economy, and it reduces some government burden. And other than that, the only two things we do from an investment perspective, either buy gold, which doesn't actually contribute, or build houses, which doesn't contribute much. It does a little bit. How else can we contribute as a former investment banker and also from an investment advice? It's for all of us. How can we do both? Invest in a way it also contributes to the economy and also be beneficial. Is it? I don't know whether it is the right question to ask, but that's something we have in our mind.
Listen, I don't think first you should underestimate the impact of your remittances or of your building houses, right? I think one person's house or one person's remittance is not going to change the macroeconomic outcome. But, I don't want to name names, but there are whole states where the economy is kept afloat by remittances and capital investments in things like house building or estate development by the diaspora. So I don't think you should underplay the economic impact of that. I think what you think you're doing for your family or your future is actually rational behavior that has also got economic impact. But I think really the two things you talked about already, which you've touched on, one is the benefit of your connectivity, your experience, your wisdom gained, if you could transfer that to the next generation in some way, targeted way, to entrepreneurs, to people like you, to people who are asking the right questions. And if we can facilitate some of it, because otherwise it's vast, it's like infinite to infinite trying to match.
Exactly.
There's no
That's
easy
where the
way.
challenge is. Like we're shooting
So
in the dark.
that's what the government really needs to facilitate. And I think the second is that if there's some collective way, like, historically the government of India has done things like NRI bonds, right?
Yeah.
I forget what they called, emerging India bonds. So they mop up capital at relatively 1 or 2% lower interest rate than the government bond, using the goodwill of the NRI to contribute back. So, there are things we can do, but of course, many of that in a country like India, we are constrained at the state level by the fact that the union government decides a lot of those outcomes. But things like targeted funds we can do. So, off the top of my head, I would say there are many channels. It doesn't have to be only through professional. It can be through the school education system or the college education system. But we have started to take some steps, right? We run an annual non-resident Tamil conclave. We have a board. We have members from the board from different parts of the world. So we are trying to increase the number of touch points and increase the efficiency of the fit of the interface. I hope it will yield some results going forward. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. This is the last question, but I don't want to ask this question, but since we are in a book fair, I had to ask this question. When can you expect a book from you, sir?
Actually, I've long had the ambition of writing, but I've never found the time. But now 3 or 4 different publishers have approached me in the last 18 months or so. So I'm actively working on a collection of my essays, speeches, etc., reformatted and properly placed and aggregated as kind of a collected essays book. And then I've long had the ambition of writing a couple of different books. One, my personal memoirs, because I've had quite a diverse life and I've been at some very interesting events in history. I was at the Twin Towers when the planes hit.
I was there.
On September 11th.
I was
you were
there.
Also there? Okay.
And Lehman, I was there on the street watching you guys walking out.
Yeah. And then I was at Lehman Brothers when it went bankrupt. And
I was there watching you guys.
Yeah. So, among other things, I have some things to write. And I have some insight into, how our democracy has evolved, how our governments function, apolitically, the nature of the structure of government, and how I think they can be improved. For now, I think the collective speeches and essays will be a start. But if I have some time, politics is on-off, right? Sometimes you win elections, sometimes you don't. And if you don't, at least you have the time to do other things. So one of these days I'll have off time, and then I'll try and work on that. But this imminent book, I hope by next year, I have an agent and I have a few publishers interested, so I hope that by early next year or something, I'll have a draft copy.
Thank you, sir. Hopefully in next Sharjah Book Fair, we'll see that.
Yeah, that's unlike being called when I've not yet written a book. Next year I may have actual book and then be called. So.
My name is Yarene, and as a young person on the internet, it feels like every cycle there is a next huge technological development that's going to change the world, like cryptocurrencies and NFTs, and currently it feels like AI. And after a very short period of time, they tend to fizzle out after creating a lot of environmental damage. And they all feel too far away out of the control of common people like me. Is there anything we can do from our small range of control to mitigate the damages caused by fast-moving tech cycles?
Look, I don't have a very heartening answer at some level. At some other level, I would say, change is inevitable. Everything changes all the time. There's very little that stays the same. And early on in my life, at least, I learned that there's at least 3 kinds of reactions to change. I'm not saying every person does the same reaction all the time, but 3 kinds of reactions. One is to ignore it or assume it will go away and not be lasting. And that in my mind is very dangerous because change is going to happen. The other, which is people like me, want to get, if not ahead of it, want to ride it as quickly as possible and shape it. We want to be the agents of change. We want to be what tomorrow looks like. And I'm not talking about technology, but I'm saying generally in policy, in reform, in whatever it is. And then the vast majority of people struggle to keep up with change and adapt to change, which you have to, right? So let's just take the examples you gave. Whether it's crypto, whether it's NFT, or whether it's blockchain that is the underlying for all of these, it is upon us, it is having some impact. Maybe it was expected to have a much greater impact much more quickly, but it is with us nonetheless, it is not going away, and it will continue to scale at some point. But as a finance person, I would say, I don't touch crypto because I don't understand how it works and I don't understand how it's valued. And the golden rule in finance is don't invest in things you don't understand. That's just simple, right? Number one. Number two, if you're talking about things like AI, what you have to realize is that the leading edge, first of all, this is not the first coming of AI. In my active professional career of 30 or 40 years, is probably the 3rd or 4th or 5th coming of AI. But what is different now is that we have almost infinite capability to generate data, to store data, and to process, meaning computing power, particularly with the cloud and all that, has become so high that you can do the kinds of things you couldn't do before. It's not that there's brilliant new algorithms or brilliant breakthrough in neural learning or in, it's just that the sheer execution capability or the capacity to generate, hold, process has gone up hugely. That doesn't mean that it's going to come universally tomorrow. The amount of capital that is going to be needed, the amount of energy that is going to be needed, the amount of processing power, and therefore the amount of production of the new generation of kinds of GPUs and all that is going to be needed it's a big bottleneck. These things are not like just because the invention has happened doesn't mean you can produce 1 million of them tomorrow, right? So it's going to take time. So I would say the general trend with technology is that every few 4, 5, 10 years, in my lifetime, I think the advent of the PC, the advent of the graphical user interface, the advent of analog digital converters of a scale that you could actually use computers to manage other processes. Therefore, through that, the notion of ERP systems, then the internet first wave, then kind of, IoT, now kind of the internet second wave and connected networks at levels we never thought possible, universal video, universal broadband, now going to AI or industrial revolution 4. See, these are all evolutions that have happened in the last 30, 40. They're all real, meaning there are actual consequences, not just that it comes and goes. Of course, there are sometimes environmental consequences of it, like the amount of energy that needs to be generated to power this many data centers and this many processors is huge. But a lot of these companies have now committed to going green, like Microsoft says in 3 to 5 years, and they have the money for it. Even if they can't generate it green, they say we'll buy only green energy. And in places like Tamil Nadu, we facilitate that. We allow them to buy from a remote location that's produced green and use it in a place where it's convenient because the submarine cables come there and the reliability of that place is better, security is better. So government can facilitate some policy for these kinds of things. But you must assume that all of these are going to happen. Some will happen more universally than others. Some will happen more rapidly than others. But change is inevitable. And at the very least, you should be thinking about how you will adapt. Ideally, you want to say how you will benefit from or channel or drive change. You can't do that. You should at least be thinking about how you will adapt to a different world. Because if you stay back, you'll be left behind, right? That's the reality. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Jayanti Mala Suresh, an entrepreneur living in Dubai for 30 years nearly. I'm an ardent fan of Sheikh Mohammed, who made a second heaven on earth, that is Dubai, the most favored destination of the world. Okay, we live very safe here, the most safest and secured country in this world. And you are the pride of Tamil Nadu, pride of India, and pride of the entire globe. Okay, so I have three short questions for you. Okay, which is the best in the world? Democracy or monopolistic country like us, or monarchy? Between these two, because you are a super duper economic reformist. Okay, they say you are the future Manmohan Singh, but I see you something better than that. You are going to be the future finance minister of India, because India is, if we have to sustain as a superpower of India, we need brains like you, sir, because you're very modest, but I know your capability and everything. So the first question is between monarchy and democracy, because democracy suppresses the quality people like you. So I want to know which is the best one. Second is, what is the difference between the economic policies and the monetary policies? And the last but not the least is, if you are given a chance to head the finance of our country, ரஜினிகாந்த் மாதிரி அதிரடியா என்ன எக்கனாமிக் ரிஃபார்ம் கொண்டு வருவீங்க, எப்படி இந்த இன்க்ளூசிவ் குரூத்தை கொண்டாடுவீங்க? ரஜினிகாந்த் மாதிரி ஒரு பஞ்ச் டயலாக் உங்க கிட்ட இருந்து எதிர்பார்க்கிறேன். Thank you.
The third one I won't touch, madam. It's all hypothetical. I'm not even going anywhere there. The second one is easy. I don't know about economic. Normally in economic theory, monetary policy is about how liquidity and the currency is managed, and that is set by the central bank of the country, usually through interest rates, bank reserve ratios, other kinds of market controls. They try to increase or decrease the supply of money and the rate at which it can be borrowed, including now new terms that never existed in financial theory or economic theory, like quantitative easing, have become generic terms now. So this is monetary policy. Fiscal policy is how the government manages its finances, the people's finances, its balance sheet, its debt, and so forth. So normally monetary policy and fiscal policy should be relatively independent of each other. Central bank should work apolitically and manage to contain inflation and yet keep conditions at reasonable borrowing rates, reasonable rates of return for capital of new projects. That's the central bank's job. And then fiscal policy is, for all the reasons I said, the government's job. The first question, I don't think there is one good or one best system. I've seen all kinds of systems work. I completely agree with you that Dubai has done phenomenally well, mostly on the vision. It was not natural resource driven. It was vision and execution. But I think that's the key, it's execution. It's not which model, it is how well you implement and execute the model that matters. At the end of the day, that is really the weakest link of all places. Everybody can talk. What can you do? How effectively can you do it? And how consistently can you do it? That is really the kind of defining variable. And so I think whatever model you have, some will do it fantastically well, others will do it okay, and others will fail. Every model, I can give you examples within monarchies that have done fantastically well, that have not done so well. Within democracies that have done relatively well, relatively not so well. I don't think there's a clear answer one way or the other. I'd say whichever model you have, you must do as good a job executing it as possible. That defines outcomes.
Good evening, Mr. Palanivel. I'm James. I'm a journalist from Malaysia. It was a very inspiring speech. The only other time that I heard somebody speak with such depth was Kamal Nath when I was in India. Okay, my question relates to AI actually. Even yesterday, there was one expert from South Korea on sustainable energy who said that everybody is talking about AI, but nobody is talking about the fact that AI cannot function without electricity, and who's going to supply the electricity in such quantity? Okay, my question about AI is, as an economist and as a finance minister before, how do you see AI playing out in the free market system, given the fact that even now, before AI is blooming to its full potential, you see a lot of people being laid off, you find a lot of unemployment, and the world population is growing. So what is the threat or challenge that is being posed to AI? Are we going to see in years to come a throwback into socialism? Thank you.
I think there's at least two different questions there. The first question is, of course, AI is going to require a huge amount of processing power, right? These are not, to do the amount of computations with the amount of data that's required to really get the good outcomes is going to require some orders of magnitude of energy compared to what data centers and computing powers use now. But the flip side is, technology can greatly improve the efficiency and in some cases reduce the need for services. I was just giving this example day before yesterday. I was in Singapore at the FinTech Festival. I said, yes, we're going to need a lot more energy for data centers. But if we're smart, when I was finance minister, and I believe it still today, we should not be building any more government buildings or setting up any more government energy usage at all. We have to go simply online. I don't need more collector offices, more tahsildar offices, more circuit houses. It's all nonsense. It's irrelevant, right? The more I have people interact with government employees, the greater the chance of friction, rent seeking, run around, all these problems. I want to move everything online, reduce the need for new buildings. So on a per capita basis, just the simplest example, on a per capita basis, I should reduce the need for infrastructure and energy on the part of the government, which is a huge component or huge proportion of the total spending. And then if I start applying things like AI-based analysis to identifying beneficiaries or to eliminating waste or to reducing fraud, I'm going to get much bigger upside. So in the medium term itself, I'm not even talking in the long term, in the medium term itself, my view is that whatever the cost of the energy of implementing technology in general and AI in particular, I will get at least that much benefit or more from what it can do for me. Again, technology in general and AI in particular. Then the next question is it going to be a great job killer? I would say that AI is not yet ubiquitous enough. If you're seeing job losses now, it's hard for me to say that's because of AI. I'm not sure that we have enough general capability, generative AI or any other AI that could have already led to people losing jobs. I think it's a natural cycle that some kind of jobs disappear and new kinds of jobs appear. For example, in the era of AI, there will be a lot less need for traditional programmers, and there will be a lot more need for domain specialists and prompt engineering and kinds of things. So there will be some, what Schumpeter called creative destruction. Some things will go away and other things will come. Overall, I would say if you look at the history of technology, and this is also one of my old professors at MIT, he has shown many examples, Brynjolfsson, where historically the onset of technology has actually been augmentative to human capability and human productivity. At first, it just increases and leverages human capability. By the time that technology is so mature that it is capable of replacing humans, is probably a generation. It takes 10, 15, 20 years in doing that job. And by then, other jobs would have come. So in the early part, at least, the productivity increase is much higher. The job loss is much lower. I'll give you a classic example of that. When I went to the US in 1987, factory automation was not yet upon us. As I say, first we started seeing kind of what they called thin clients, AD converters. That led to ERP systems. That led to more centralized planning and resource allocation. Eventually, better robotics, all these things. If you ask me, in 1987, there were jobs in manufacturing that were manual jobs with relatively low skill that were paying in the US at that time, in that day's money, $30, $40 an hour. That was the standard wage in manufacturing plants. Now if you ask me, 90% of those jobs are gone. If I go to a big auto assembly plant or a big OEM manufacturer, where there used to be 100 people, there are probably 10 people, 15 people now. The robots have become that good, the process have become that integrated, 100% is computerized. But that took how many years? I'm talking from 1987 till probably 2017. So there will be disruption, there will be the loss of some kinds of jobs, there will be the creation of other kinds of jobs. I'm not overly stressed that this is some demonic, one-time kind of decimator of human opportunity.
Good evening, sir. We have been hearing you since India today is conclave about that human capital, converting TN into human capital to serve worldwide. Now you were saying that we have upskilled about 3 million people in the last 3 years, right? That sounds very low according to whatever the capacity we have in Tamil Nadu. Another thing is, if we have upskilled only 3 million, but the gap remains same, the knowledge gap, between knowledge, not the knowledge gap, the qualification to the skill gap, it is still remaining. Do you think Tamil curriculum in professional fields will help? That's my question, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure. First, I think you should just remember the scale, sir. If you think 3 million is small, I first give you some proportions. So the population of Tamil Nadu, maybe we think is around 75 million people. We don't know because we haven't had a census since 2011. Now they're getting prepared for 5 years late, the 2021 census. Let's say it's 75 million people. The voting age people is about 60 million or roughly so. The workforce of Tamil Nadu, the last I heard, informal plus informal employment altogether is about 33 million. The annual graduating capacity of the entire college system of Tamil Nadu is probably between 800,000 and 1 million people. So in that context, if you tell me 3 million is very low, I say no, 3 million is a big number. It's not a low number, right? So even so, if you say, therefore, am I very proud that we're doing everything we can't do better? No, we can do a lot better, but we started at zero. We started at zero. If we have done 3 million people in 3.5 years, that is a very, very good number. It's more than the equivalent of 3 or 4 years of graduating classes. And remember, we are not educating them from baseline. We are just doing that finishing touch of what it is they need. And it has had impact. If you say, can we do more? We can do more. We will do more. Whether the question of going to Tamil education in things like engineering college, I don't know. It's a complex question. At the end of the day, the market for talent is a global market. I'm not sure there is a huge local market. And it's not my field, and my party doesn't have a policy, so I don't want to overstretch myself. But as an individual, as a professional, as somebody who's worked around the world, I would say one of the greatest strengths we have in Tamil Nadu has been our two-language policy, is that everybody has learned enough English, and we have a English-speaking workforce that can communicate both when jobs come into the country and when we go out of the country. And so I'm not sure that I would give up the two-language formula for a one-language formula, prima facie. That's just my view.
Thank you so much, sir. And with regards to all love and respect for this great man here, I would like to say all the people of this, as the spectators, please to stand up and end it with an applause. Thank you so much.